The arrival. The space station was alive with activity. Bright lights flickered across towering walls, and the hum of different languages filled the air. Merchants called out to passers-by, offering rare alien artifacts, strange fruits, and glowing crystals. Travelers from across the galaxy bustled through the crowded corridors, their appearances as varied as their destinations. Some had shimmering scales, others had metallic limbs, but even in this chaos, one figure stood out. She was unlike anyone they had ever seen. Her name was Leia. Her skin was a deep, iridescent blue, glowing faintly as if lit from within. Her long, silver hair cascaded down her back, and her eyes were a sharp violet, scanning the crowd with an intensity that made everyone pause. Wherever she walked, heads turned. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Even the merchants, who were used to all kinds of beings, fell silent as she passed. "Who is she?" whispered a merchant to his neighbor. "A royal. A warrior?" "Doesn't matter," the neighbor replied. "Look at her. She's searching for someone." Leia ignored the stares. She moved with purpose, her steps light but determined. She clutched a small device in her hand, its screen glowing faintly as it guided her deeper into the station. The device beeped softly, signaling she was close. Her heart raced. She had been searching for weeks, traveling from one system to another. Now finally, she was here. Far from the bustling crowd, in a quiet workshop tucked away in a dim corner of the station, Ethan worked alone. He was human, a rarity in this part of the galaxy. His brown hair was tousled, and his hands were covered in grease as he tinkered with a broken piece of machinery. The workshop was a mess. Tools scattered everywhere, blueprints piled high on a desk, and the faint smell of burning metal in the air. Ethan preferred it this way. He liked being away from the noise and distractions. He was known for his skill in fixing almost anything, but he kept to himself. Most people overlooked him, just another human in a galaxy full of extraordinary beings. The workshop door slid open with a quiet hiss. Ethan didn't look up, assuming it was another customer bringing something to repair. "If you're here for a fix, leave it on the counter," he said, his voice distracted as he tightened a bolt. The silence that followed made him pause. He looked up, and his wrench slipped from his hand, clattering to the floor. Standing in the doorway was Leia. Her glowing presence seemed to fill the small room. Ethan stared, unsure if he was dreaming. She was the most striking person he had ever seen, but it wasn't just her appearance. There was something in her eyes. Determination, desperation, and something else he couldn't quite place. "You're Ethan," she said. Her voice was calm but carried a weight that made him sit up straight. Yeah, that's me," he replied, still unsure what was happening. "Do I know you?" "No," she said, stepping closer. "But I know you. You're the one I've been looking for." Ethan blinked, confusion etched on his face. "Me? Why? I'm just an engineer." "There's no way." "You're more than that," she interrupted. Her violet eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, he felt as if she could see straight into his soul. "I need your help, Ethan. And I don't have much time." Before he could respond, a loud commotion erupted outside. Shouts and hurried footsteps echoed through the corridors. Leia's expression hardened. She glanced at the door, then back at Ethan. "They'd found me," she said, her voice now a whisper. "We have to leave. Now." Ethan's heart pounded. "Who's found you? What's going on?" "There's no time to explain," Leia said, grabbing his arm. "If we stay here, they'll kill us both." The urgency in her voice left no room for argument. Ethan hesitated for only a second before nodding. He grabbed his tool bag and followed her out the door. As they stepped into the corridor, Ethan saw them. 4 armed figures moving quickly through the crowd. Their eyes scanned the area, searching. Leia pulled Ethan into a side passage, her grip firm but not painful. "Stay close," she said, "and trust me." Ethan had no idea what he had just gotten himself into, but one thing was clear: this was no ordinary day. And this was no ordinary woman. The mystery deepens. Ethan's heart was still racing as they slipped through the dim, narrow corridors of the space station. Laia led the way, her movements swift and deliberate. She seemed to know exactly where she was going, though Ethan couldn't tell how. The faint glow of her skin lit their path, adding an almost surreal quality to their escape. They stopped in an empty storage bay. The hum of machinery and distant footsteps echoed faintly in the background. Laia turned to face Ethan, her violet eyes scanning his face as if trying to decide whether she could truly trust him. Ethan, still catching his breath, stared at her in disbelief. "Okay," he said, holding up his hands. "You've dragged me out of my workshop, got us running through the station like fugitives, and now we're hiding in a storage room. I think I deserve some answers." Laia's expression softened, but her tone remained firm. "You're right. You do. But first, let me ask you something." She stepped closer, her gaze intense. "Have you ever felt like you were meant for something more, Ethan? Like you had a purpose beyond what you see in front of you?" Ethan blinked, caught off guard by the question. "I mean, maybe. But what does that have to do with?" "Everything," Laia interrupted. She held up the small device she had been clutching earlier. Its screen displayed a complex pattern of symbols and numbers. "This brought me to you. It's a tracker, but not just any tracker. It responds to unique energy signatures, those tied to extraordinary people, people who can change the course of events." Ethan frowned. "You've got the wrong guy. I'm just an engineer. I fix broken things, that's it." "That's exactly why you're the right guy," Laia said, her voice softening. "The artifact I'm trying to repair. It's ancient, far beyond the technology of most species. I searched the galaxy for someone with the skills to help me. You're the only one who matches the requirements." Ethan's skepticism deepened. "An artifact? This sounds like some sci-fi holodrama plot. What does it even do?" Laia hesitated, glancing at the storage bay entrance as if expecting someone to burst in. Then she leaned in closer. "It's a key," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "A key to unlocking a power that could save my people, or destroy us all if it falls into the wrong hands." Ethan rubbed his temples, trying to process her words. "And I'm supposed to believe that out of everyone in the galaxy, you came to me. A human. Someone who's never even seen half the tech you're talking about." "Yes," Laia said firmly. "Because it's not just about your skills. It's about your heart. Your choices. The tracker doesn't just detect ability. It detects something deeper. You have a sense of compassion and ingenuity that most beings lack. That's why I need you." Before Ethan could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor outside. Laia's head snapped toward the noise, her glowing skin dimming slightly as she pressed a finger to her lips. Ethan tensed, his pulse quickening. The footsteps grew louder. Ethan could make out voices now, low, guttural tones speaking a language he didn't understand. He glanced at Laia, who was already moving toward a stack of crates, motioning for him to follow. They crouched behind the crates just as the door to the storage bay slid open. Two figures entered, both tall and heavily armed. Their reptilian features and glowing red eyes gave them an intimidating presence. They scanned the room, their weapons raised. Ethan held his breath, his heart hammering in his chest. Laia's hand rested lightly on his arm, a silent reassurance that they would get through this. The tension in the air was suffocating. One of the figures spoke into a communicator. "No sign of her here. We'll keep searching." After a few agonizing moments, the intruders left, the door hissing shut behind them. Ethan exhaled slowly, his nerves still on edge. "That was too close," he whispered. "Who are these guys, and why are they after you?" "They're bounty hunters," Laia replied, her voice low. "Hired by those who want the artifact for their own gain. If they find it before we do, countless lives will be at risk." Ethan shook his head, trying to make sense of it all. "This is insane. I'm not a hero, Laia. I don't even know where to start." "You don't have to be a hero," Laia said, her tone gentle but firm. "You just have to be willing to try. That's all I'm asking." Ethan stared at her, torn between fear and the strange pull he felt toward her cause. He didn't understand why she had chosen him, but there was something in her eyes, a mix of hope and desperation, that made him want to believe her. "Okay," he said finally, his voice steady despite the chaos swirling around him. "I'll help you. But if we're going to do this, you need to tell me everything. No more secrets." Laia nodded, a small smile breaking through her serious expression. "I promise. From this point on, we're in this together." As they prepared to leave the storage bay, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just taken a turn he could never have imagined. And deep down, he knew there was no turning back. The pursuit. Ethan barely had time to process what was happening as Laia led him through the maze-like corridors of the space station. The air was thick with tension, every shadow seeming to hide a new threat. The glow from Laia's skin dimmed as they moved, her way of blending into the dimly lit surroundings. "You sure you know where you're going?" Ethan whispered, his voice tinged with doubt. "I know enough," she replied without looking back. Her tone left no room for argument. "We just need to stay ahead of them." "Them," Ethan muttered under his breath. "Right. The bounty hunters, or whoever else is after you." "Great." Behind them, faint echoes of hurried footsteps and muffled voices grew louder. Ethan could feel his heart pounding in his chest, his instincts screaming at him to stop and hide. But Laia didn't stop. She moved with a sense of urgency, as if she had rehearsed this escape 100 times. They rounded a corner and entered a quieter section of the station, where the lights flickered intermittently. The sound of machinery hummed in the background, a steady rhythm that contrasted with the chaos they had just left behind. Laia finally slowed her pace, allowing Ethan to catch his breath. "Okay," Ethan said, leaning against a wall. "I think I deserve an update. Where are we going?" "Somewhere safe," Laia replied curtly, scanning the area. "At least safer than here." Ethan ran a hand through his messy hair. "You're really good at being vague, you know that." Laia paused, turning to face him. Her violet eyes softened, though the urgency in her expression remained. "I know this is overwhelming for you, but if we stop now, they'll catch us. And if they catch us, we're both as good as dead." Before Ethan could respond, the sound of heavy boots echoed from the direction they had just come from. Laia's head snapped toward the noise, her glowing skin brightening for a brief moment before she dimmed it again. "Move," she said sharply, grabbing Ethan's arm and pulling him down another corridor. This time, the chase felt more frantic. The footsteps were closer, and Ethan could hear the unmistakable hum of energy weapons being charged. Panic surged through him, but Laia's grip on his arm was firm, her presence somehow grounding him in the chaos. They passed through a service hatch into a narrow maintenance tunnel. The walls were lined with exposed pipes and cables, the air heavy with the smell of metal and oil. It was a tight fit, but Laia seemed unfazed, navigating the cramped space with ease. "This doesn't exactly scream safe," Ethan muttered, ducking under a low-hanging pipe. "It's better than out there," Laia shot back, her voice low. "These tunnels aren't on the official schematics. It'll buy us time." Ethan couldn't argue with that. As they moved deeper into the tunnels, the sounds of pursuit grew fainter. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to hope they might actually escape. But that hope was short-lived. The tunnel suddenly opened into a larger maintenance bay, and waiting for them were two of the bounty hunters. They were reptilian in appearance, their scales glinting under the dim light. Each one held a plasma rifle, the barrels glowing ominously. "Well, well," one of them hissed, his voice dripping with malice. "The royal exile and her human pet. How touching." Ethan froze, his mind racing. He had no weapon, no plan, and no idea how they were going to get out of this. But Laia stepped forward, her posture calm but commanding. "Let us pass," she said, her voice steady. "You don't want to do this." The second bounty hunter laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Oh, but we do. There's a hefty price on your head, princess, and your little human friend will make a nice bonus." Laya's eyes narrowed, and Ethan noticed a faint shimmer in the air around her. It was subtle, but it made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," she said, her tone icy. Before the bounty hunters could respond, Laya moved. She was a blur of motion, faster than Ethan could follow. In an instant, she disarmed the nearest bounty hunter, her hand glowing with an energy Ethan couldn't comprehend. The second hunter raised his rifle, but Ethan, acting on pure instinct, lunged forward and knocked the weapon aside. The fight was chaotic and desperate. Laya's movements were precise and almost otherworldly, her combat skills far beyond anything Ethan had ever seen. He, on the other hand, was clumsy but determined, using his wits to outmaneuver the second hunter long enough for Laya to finish her fight. When it was over, both bounty hunters lay unconscious on the ground. Ethan was breathing heavily, his hands shaking. "Remind me," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "to never doubt you again." Laya offered him a faint smile, though her expression quickly turned serious. "We don't have time to rest. Others will be coming." "Great," Ethan muttered, grabbing his tool bag from where it had fallen. Just another day at the office. As they exited the maintenance bay and disappeared into the shadows, Ethan couldn't help but wonder what he had gotten himself into. But one thing was certain, he was in too deep to back out now. The truth. Ethan and Laya slipped into the hidden alcove of a derelict section of the space station. The air was stale, and the walls were coated with years of neglect. Laya inspected their surroundings, ensuring they weren't being followed, while Ethan leaned against a rusty beam, struggling to catch his breath. "This is insane," he wheezed, wiping the sweat from his brow. "I'm just a guy who fixes broken machines. How am I suddenly running from bounty hunters and hiding in back alleys with an alien princess?" Laya turned to face him, her violet eyes softening for the first time since their escape began. "I never said I was a princess," she corrected, though her voice carried the weight of unspoken truths. "Right, because that's the part of this story that doesn't make sense," Ethan replied, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He looked at her, waiting for an explanation. "You've been dragging me through hell for hours now. I think it's time you told me what's really going on." Laya hesitated. She glanced at the floor, her expression conflicted. Then, with a deep breath, she began. "I come from a planet called Seraphis," she said, her tone measured. "It's a world rich in resources and technology, one of the most advanced in the galaxy. But with that advancement came greed and corruption. My people developed something extraordinary, something dangerous." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Let me guess. The artifact." She nodded. "We call it the core of Antra. It's an ancient relic, older than my civilization itself. It has the power to manipulate energy at a fundamental level, to heal, to destroy, to create. It can do almost anything, depending on who wields it. For centuries, it was kept safe by the Sci-Fi Council. But when a faction of my people tried to use it as a weapon, a civil war broke out." Ethan frowned. "And you're part of this council?" Laya shook her head. "I was part of the faction that believed the core should be destroyed. I argued that no civilization, no matter how advanced, should have that kind of power. But I was overruled. The council wanted to keep it under lock and key, while others sought to claim it for themselves." Her voice wavered, and she looked away. "I tried to stop them. I failed. The core was stolen, and its power unleashed. My people turned on each other, and the war left Seraphis in ruins. The few of us who survived scattered across the galaxy, each carrying a piece of the core to prevent it from being whole again." Ethan stared at her, trying to wrap his head around the enormity of what she was saying. "So let me get this straight," he said slowly. "You're telling me that you're carrying one of these pieces, and that's why everyone's after you." Leia nodded. The piece I carry is the key to activating the entire core. Without it, the other fragments are useless. That's why I've been on the run, and that's why I need your help. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. Okay, but why me? You said I'm supposed to fix something. What am I supposed to do with an ancient alien artifact? The core isn't just a weapon, Leia explained. It's a living machine, built with technology that responds to its user's intent. It's damaged, and only someone with your skills can repair it. The tracker led me to you because you're not just an engineer. You're the kind of person who sees solutions where others see problems. Ethan snorted. That's a nice way of saying I'm stubborn. Leia smiled faintly. Perhaps, but it's exactly what we need. Before Ethan could reply, the faint hum of voices echoed from the corridor outside. Leia's smile vanished, replaced by a look of sharp focus. She motioned for Ethan to stay quiet and pressed herself against the wall, listening intently. The voices grew louder, accompanied by the heavy clanking of armored boots. Ethan felt his stomach twist. They found us, didn't they? He whispered. Leia nodded, her expression grim. We need to move. But just as they prepared to slip out, a shadow fell across the entrance to their hiding spot. A towering figure stepped into view, a bounty hunter, his reptilian features twisted into a cruel grin. Found you, he hissed, leveling a plasma rifle at them. Ethan froze, his mind racing. But before the hunter could fire, Leia raised her hand. A shimmering wave of energy erupted from her palm, striking the rifle and sending it flying out of the hunter's grasp. The creature snarled and lunged at her, but Leia moved with lightning speed, dodging his attack and countering with a graceful, almost dance-like maneuver. Ethan watched in awe as Leia fought, her movements fluid and precise. But as the battle raged on, another bounty hunter appeared, this one armed with a disruptor blade. Ethan felt panic rise in his chest. He wasn't a fighter. He wasn't a hero. But if he didn't do something, they were both dead. Summoning every ounce of courage, Ethan grabbed a heavy wrench from his tool bag and swung it at the second hunter. The blow caught the creature off guard, and it staggered backward, giving Leia the opening she needed to finish the fight. When the dust settled, both hunters lay unconscious on the floor. Leia turned to Ethan, her violet eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and surprise. Not bad for a guy who fixes machines, she said. Ethan managed a shaky smile. Yeah, well, I'm full of surprises. As they fled deeper into the station, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was in way over his head. But for the first time, he also felt something else. Purpose. Betrayal. The abandoned sector of the space station was eerily quiet, its dim corridors illuminated by flickering lights. Leia and Ethan sat in a small storage room, catching their breath after yet another narrow escape. Leia checked the energy reserves on her handheld device, while Ethan wiped grease off his hands. For the first time since their chaotic journey began, a fragile sense of calm settled between them. So, Ethan began, his voice cutting through the silence. What's the next step? We keep running until they give up, or do you actually have a plan? Leia looked up, her violet eyes meeting his. We need to find a safe place to analyze the fragment and prepare it for repair. There's an old contact of mine on this station who might be able to help. Ethan raised an eyebrow. A friend. More of an ally, Leia admitted, her tone cautious. Someone I worked with before. All of this. He has access to resources we'll need. Ethan leaned back against the wall. Skepticism etched across his face. And you trust him? Leia hesitated, her gaze dropping to the device in her hands. I don't trust anyone, she said finally, but we don't have many options. The unease in her voice sent a chill down Ethan's spine, but he didn't press further. They had no time to argue. If this mysterious ally could offer them even a sliver of hope, it was worth the risk. A short while later, they arrived at a decrepit docking bay on the station's lower levels. The area was deserted, save for a lone figure standing near a rusted cargo crate. He was a tall, wiry man with slicked-back silver hair and a mischievous glint in his sharp golden eyes. He wore a long coat patched with various fabrics, giving him the appearance of a scavenger who thrived on chaos. "Laia," the man greeted, his voice smooth and charming. "It's been a while." "Varric," Laia replied tersely. "I didn't come here for pleasantries. We need your help." Varric's gaze shifted to Ethan, sizing him up with a smirk. "And who's this?" "Your new bodyguard. I didn't think humans were your type." Ethan crossed his arms, unimpressed. "I'm just here to keep things running. Are you going to help us or not?" Varric chuckled, his golden eyes glinting in the dim light. "Feisty. I like him." He turned back to Laia. "Of course, I'll help you. But you know my price." Laia stiffened. "You'll get what you want when we're safe." Varric's grin widened. "Fair enough. Follow me." Varric led them to a hidden chamber beneath the docking bay. The room was filled with advanced equipment, far more sophisticated than anything Ethan had expected to find in such a rundown part of the station. Monitors lined the walls, displaying streams of data in alien scripts, while a central table held tools and devices that seemed years ahead of anything Ethan had worked with before. Ethan whistled, impressed despite himself. Not bad for a guy who looks like he sells scrap for a living. Varric laughed. "Appearances can be deceiving, my friend. Now, let's see this fragment." Laia hesitated, then pulled a small glowing shard from her satchel. It pulsed faintly, its light casting intricate patterns on the walls. Varric's eyes widened as he leaned closer, his expression a mix of awe and greed. "Incredible," he whispered. "I've heard stories about the core, but to see a piece of it in person." "Focus, Varric," Laia said sharply. "Can you help us or not?" Varric straightened, his expression shifting back to its usual smugness. "Of course, but this kind of work takes time and privacy." Laia nodded. "We'll stay here until it's done." Ethan noticed a flicker of something in Varric's eyes, something that made his stomach churn. He stepped closer to Laia, lowering his voice. "Are you sure about this guy? He seems off." Laia glanced at Varric, who was already engrossed in examining the fragment, then back at Ethan. "I don't trust him," she admitted quietly, "but he's the only one who has the tools we need." Ethan frowned but said nothing. He didn't like it, but he couldn't deny the logic. Still, he kept a close eye on Varric as the man worked, his instincts screaming that something wasn't right. Hours passed, and Varric's progress seemed genuine. But as Ethan watched him input data into one of the monitors, a stray reflection caught his eye. On a small side screen, a message blinked in an alien language. Ethan couldn't read it, but the accompanying image, a bounty hunter's insignia, made his blood run cold. He grabbed Laia's arm, pulling her aside. "He's selling us out," Ethan whispered urgently. "That screen. He's contacting someone." Laia's expression darkened. Without a word, she approached Varric, her movements swift and precise. Before Varric could react, she grabbed the fragment and stepped back, her posture rigid with anger. "What are you doing, Varric?" she demanded. Varric's charming facade cracked. He straightened, his smile now a cold sneer. "You didn't really think I'd pass up a chance like this, did you? The bounty on your head is worth more than anything you could offer me." Ethan clenched his fists. "You slimy." The door to the chamber slid open, and a group of armed bounty hunters stormed in, their weapons trained on Laia and Ethan. Varric stepped aside, grinning smugly. "Nothing personal, Laia. Just business." Laia's grip on the fragment tightened, her glowing skin dimming as she prepared to fight. Ethan grabbed a nearby tool, ready to defend himself. "Trust me," Laia whispered to Ethan, her voice low but steady. "When the time comes, follow my lead." Ethan nodded, his heart pounding. Whatever happened next, he knew one thing for certain. This was far from over. The escape, The room was thick with tension as the bounty hunters surrounded Ethan and Laia. Their weapons hummed with charged energy, and their leader, a towering alien with jagged armor and glowing yellow eyes, stepped forward. Varric stood smugly to the side, his betrayal evident in the grin plastered across his face. "Hand over the fragment," the leader growled, his voice like grinding metal, "and maybe we'll let you live." Ethan's grip tightened on the makeshift weapon he'd grabbed, a heavy metal wrench. His mind raced, searching for a way out. Laia, however, remained calm. Her violet eyes scanned the room, calculating their odds. "Giving you the fragment wouldn't save us," Laia said coldly. "You've already decided we're not walking out of here." The leader chuckled darkly. "Smart girl." Without warning, Laia moved. Her hand shot up, and a burst of shimmering energy exploded from her palm. The blast caught the nearest bounty hunter off guard, sending him flying into a wall. Chaos erupted. The remaining hunters opened fire, their plasma bolts sizzling through the air. Ethan dove behind a console, his heart pounding. "You could have warned me," he shouted, narrowly avoiding a shot. "Trust me, you'll know when to move," Laia called back as she darted across the room, her agility unmatched. She weaved between the hunters, her glowing hands deflecting some of the blasts, while others scorched the walls around her. Ethan peeked out from his hiding spot, spotting a small maintenance panel on the far side of the room. If they could get to it, they might be able to escape into the station's ventilation system. But getting there was another matter entirely. "Laia," he yelled, pointing to the panel. "That's our way out." She followed his gaze, nodding as her hand flicked upward to create another burst of energy, temporarily blinding their attackers. "Cover me," she shouted. Ethan's eyes widened. "Cover you? With what?" But she was already moving. Cursing under his breath, Ethan grabbed the nearest tool he could find, a heavy coil of wiring, and hurled it at one of the hunters. It wasn't much, but it was enough to distract the alien long enough for Laia to reach the panel. She pried the cover off with her bare hands, revealing a narrow tunnel barely big enough for a person. "Ethan, now," she yelled. He didn't need to be told twice. Sprinting across the chaotic room, he narrowly avoided a plasma bolt that scorched the ground near his feet. He dove into the tunnel after Laia, who was already pulling the panel shut behind them. The last thing Ethan saw before the door closed was Varric's furious face. The tunnel was dark and cramped, with barely enough room to crawl. The sound of their pursuers banging on the panel echoed behind them, but the lock Laia had jammed was holding, at least for now. "Care to explain how we're getting out of this?" Ethan asked between breaths, his voice laced with both fear and frustration. "I have a plan," Laia said simply, her voice steady despite the situation. "Great. Another plan," Ethan muttered, shaking his head. "Your last one almost got us killed." "This one will work," she assured him, glancing back at him with a faint smile. "You're still here, aren't you?" Ethan couldn't argue with that. Despite everything, they were still alive. Barely. After what felt like an eternity of crawling, they emerged into another section of the station. This area was abandoned, the walls lined with old machinery and flickering lights. It was quiet, too quiet. "Where are we?" Ethan asked, his voice low. Laia checked her handheld device, its screen glowing faintly. "An old power conduit. It's not on the station's main map, which means it should buy us some time." "Should," Ethan echoed, raising an eyebrow. Not exactly reassuring. Laia ignored the comment, moving to one of the consoles. She began inputting commands, her fingers moving with precision. Ethan watched her, still trying to piece everything together. "You're really something, you know that," he said finally. "One minute you're dodging plasma bolts, the next you're hacking into alien tech like it's nothing." Laia paused, glancing at him. "I've had to learn quickly," she said softly. "When you're on the run, there's no room for hesitation." Ethan saw the flicker of vulnerability in her eyes, and for a moment, he forgot the danger they were in. But the sound of distant footsteps quickly snapped him back to reality. "They're coming," he said, tension returning to his voice. "I know," Laia replied, her tone calm but focused. "That's why I'm rerouting the station's energy grid. It'll overload the systems in their section and slow them down." Ethan's jaw dropped. "You're causing a blackout." "Not a full blackout," Laia corrected. "Just enough to cover our tracks." A loud hum filled the air as the lights flickered, then went out completely. Moments later, a faint explosion echoed through the station, followed by distant shouts of confusion. Laia turned to Ethan, a triumphant glint in her eyes. "Time to move." As they made their way through the darkened corridors, Ethan couldn't help but marvel at her resourcefulness. For someone who claimed not to trust anyone, Laia seemed to have a knack for relying on others to play their part. They reached an old docking bay, where a single, small ship rested in the shadows. Laia led the way, her steps quick but silent. She stopped at the ship's ramp, turning to Ethan. "This is it," she said. "Our ticket out of here." Ethan stared at the ship, then back at her. "You had a ship this whole time." "Not exactly," she admitted. "It's borrowed, but it'll get us where we need to go." Ethan shook his head, unable to suppress a wry grin. "You're unbelievable. And you're still alive," she shot back, her lips curving into a rare smile. "Now, get on board." As the ship's engines roared to life and they sped away from the station, Ethan leaned back in his seat, exhausted but alive. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe they might actually have a chance. But deep down, he knew their journey was far from over. The stolen ship hurtled through the vast expanse of space, its engines humming as Laia and Ethan prepared for the confrontation that would decide their fate. Laia sat in the cockpit, her fingers flying over the controls, while Ethan stood behind her, gripping the back of her seat tightly. "How close are we to the rendezvous point?" Ethan asked, his voice laced with tension. "Minutes away," Laia replied, her tone sharp with focus. "The fragment signal will guide us to the artifact, but they'll be waiting for us." Ethan frowned. "They? As in, the bounty hunters, or someone worse?" "Both," Laia said, her violet eyes flicking up to meet his. "The Council has likely sent their agents, and Varric's betrayal will have alerted every opportunist in the sector. We'll be walking into a trap." Ethan's grip tightened. "So why are we doing this?" "Because the core can't fall into their hands," Laia said firmly. "If they activate it with malicious intent, the damage will be irreversible." Ethan let out a long breath, his mind racing. "Okay, so what's the plan?" Laia hesitated. "We improvise." Ethan blinked. "That's not a plan." "It's the best we got," Laia said with a faint smile. "I trust your instincts, Ethan. They've gotten us this far." Ethan shook his head, muttering, "I really need to start making better life choices." The ship descended onto a barren planet, its surface a sprawling desert of cracked earth and jagged rocks. The artifact's signal pulsed stronger as they approached the coordinates, guiding them to a massive, ancient structure half buried in the sand. Its towering spires and intricate carvings hinted at a long-lost civilization, and the air around it seemed to hum with energy. "This is it," Laia said, stepping out of the ship and onto the sandy ground. The fragment in her satchel glowed brightly, resonating with the artifact inside the structure. Ethan followed, shielding his eyes from the harsh sunlight. "I have a bad feeling about this." As they approached the entrance, the sound of engines roared overhead. Several ships descended, their shadows cutting across the sand. Armed figures poured out, their weapons trained on Laia and Ethan. Among them was Varric, his smug grin as infuriating as ever. "Well, look who made it," Varric called out, his voice echoing across the desert. "I was starting to think you'd run out of luck." Laia's expression hardened. "What do you want, Varric? You already sold us out." "Don't take it personally," Varric said with a shrug. "I'm just a businessman. But since you're here, Why not hand over the fragment? Save us all some trouble. Ethan stepped forward, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. Yeah, I don't think so. You'll have to go through us first. Varric laughed. Oh, I intend to. Before anyone could fire, the ground beneath them rumbled, and the artifact inside the structure responded to the fragment's energy. A beam of light shot into the sky, splitting the clouds and sending a shockwave across the desert. The bounty hunter staggered, caught off guard, while Laia and Ethan took the opportunity to slip into the structure. The interior was a maze of glowing corridors and intricate machinery, all centered around a massive floating core in the heart of the chamber. It pulsed with an otherworldly light, casting long shadows as Laia and Ethan approached. "This is it," Laia whispered, her voice filled with awe. The core of Antra. Ethan stared at the glowing relic, his engineering mind racing to comprehend its design. "Okay, so how do we shut it down before they get here?" "We don't shut it down," Laia said, pulling the fragment from her satchel. "We restore it. But we restore it with a failsafe." Ethan's eyes widened. "You mean rig it to self-destruct?" Laia nodded. "If the wrong hands try to use it, it will destroy itself. But it has to be precise, or the blast will destroy this entire planet." "No pressure," Ethan muttered, stepping forward to inspect the core. "Okay, tell me what to do." As they worked, the sound of footsteps echoed through the structure. The bounty hunters had breached the entrance, and their shouts grew louder. Laia stood guard, her glowing hands raised, while Ethan focused on connecting the fragment to the core. "Hurry," Laia urged, deflecting a plasma bolt with a shield of energy. "We don't have much time. I'm going as fast as I can." Ethan snapped, sweat dripping down his face. The machinery sparked as he connected wires and recalibrated circuits, the core's energy growing brighter with each adjustment. Finally, with a loud hum, the core stabilized. Its glow became steady, and the air around it felt charged with power. "It's done," Ethan shouted. Laia turned to him, relief washing over her face, but their victory was short-lived. Varric and his men entered the chamber, their weapons aimed at the pair. "Step away from the core," Varric commanded. "Now." Laia stood her ground, her violet eyes blazing. "You don't understand what you're dealing with, Varric. The core isn't a toy." "I'll take my chances," Varric sneered, stepping closer. Ethan glanced at Laia, then at the core. "Laia," he whispered, "is there a failsafe?" She nodded subtly. "But you'll need to trigger it manually." Ethan's stomach sank. Figures. As Varric reached for the core, Ethan lunged forward, grabbing a panel on its surface. "You want it so bad. Fine," he shouted, pressing the failsafe activation. The core's glow intensified, and a low rumble filled the chamber. "What did you do?" Varric yelled, panic flashing across his face. "I gave you what you wanted," Ethan said with a grin. "Now run." Laia grabbed Ethan's hand, pulling him toward an escape route. The core's energy began to spiral out of control, sending shockwaves through the structure. Varric and his men scrambled to flee, their greed turning to terror. Laia and Ethan barely made it out before the core unleashed a massive pulse of energy, collapsing the structure and rendering the artifact inert. The bounty hunters' ships were destroyed in the blast, and the desert fell silent once more. As they stood in the wreckage, Ethan turned to Laia. "So what now?" "Now," Laia said, a rare smile gracing her lips, "we start over. And this time, we do it right." Ethan nodded, exhaustion and relief washing over him. "You know, for a space princess, you're not so bad." "And for a human engineer," Laia replied, "you're more than I ever hoped for." As they boarded their ship and disappeared into the stars, Ethan couldn't help but feel that their story was only just beginning.